episode 6 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I am Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading Orestes Brownson's 1865 book, The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny. This time finishing his very long section about the origin of government. We're on chapter 6, Origin of Government Concluded, where he's kind of describing the last few theories about how government comes to be and what he really believes is the right answer here. So again, he starts off with one that he thinks is wrong again, and he has another theory that he says is mostly right. And then he concludes the section with one final thought on what he really believes to be the truth about how government comes into existence and sort of what the origin of that authority is. You were saying before we started that you're really praising yourself, that you had some good thoughts on this chapter. So I'm guessing you liked it.
I did like it, and but I was mentioning that I think I've forgotten all my good thoughts.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate. We'll see how this episode goes then.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, some of what he talks about, we actually covered in general terms. You know, the two swords theory, which he's kind of like really talking about at the beginning of this, where meaning the power of the state versus the power of the of the church or the spiritual authority.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he kind of goes over that again. Some of what he says that was really brilliant, and other times I feel like he's just kind of asserting things.
Hmm.
I agree with him, but like just the premise of the spiritual authority. I mean, we can go into it a little bit more, and we're going to go into it, I'm sure, a little bit more in depth. But that the spiritual authority necessarily has preeminence over the state or the governmental authority in some areas and not others. That type of thing, and of course, is an assumption that there is a God. I think, which
Yeah.
I think is I'm not arguing with the guy, but it's not like he's arguing from first principles or something. He's just getting to the meat of, okay, this is our society. This is what people believe and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I would say so, because we're really kind of picking up from last chapter, because he ended last chapter talking about really the idea that kings get their authority directly from God, and it's a very supernatural occurrence. It's given to them directly, and things like that. And he points out all the reasons why that's wrong. And he says, there's a different sort of idea, along those similar lines, but the one that he's describing here is that there are two authorities on earth, the spiritual and the temporal just gets his authority from the spiritual. So it's like from God through the Pope to temporal leaders is kind of how this theory is articulated. And he points out that that's never really been a dogma of the church. Certain people have argued in favor of it in the past, but he says, those people are mistaken. A lot of the better church doctors and things like that have argued against that idea that it's not just derived specifically from the Pope. But that's the idea there, is that the Pope just grants authority to certain, kings and princes and stuff like that.
Yeah, he was doing such a good job explaining that theory that I was thinking, God, is he really gonna is he gonna advocate for this? And then he explains it, then he quickly says, well, that's where that's nothing but trouble, really. And for mischievousness or tyranny or whatever, if the Pope is ordaining, that's the person. The Pope is providing a spiritual authority for kings. Like that whole theory that they can ordain whoever it is the king, and that authority comes from the Pope, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Because he starts off talking about, kind of in biblical terms, that at some point in time, those two offices were combined. Moses held the role of both chief priest and, physical ruler, of the Israelites. So we do have this understanding that sometimes they are united in one person. He says, it's not really sure when those two things split. And he points out, the Roman Empire too. The emperor was also Pontifex Maximus, as well as the imperator, the head of the religious, as well as the head of the civic. And so it's this idea that, we do have two, sometimes they're combined into one. And then he kind of keeps going and saying, but then once they do split, it's understood, in this theory, if you believe this theory, that the priestly office by its own nature is superior to the kingly, and in all primitive nations with a separate organized priesthood, whether a true priesthood or a corrupt, the priest is held to be above the king, elects or establishes the law by which is selected the temporal chief and inducts him into his office as if he received his authority from God through the priesthood. So it's again that very supernatural idea, through the priest into the king.
Yes.
I guess you have no follow up on that.
No, I
Um,
think it's a great summary, and I had underlined that same passage, which was on
mhm,
what, page 55.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it's a good synopsis, and then he talks about, what's the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal, and he mentions, there can be no question that the spiritual is superior to the temporal, and I don't know if it gets to it here. I should probably have a summary of notes rather than just handwritten notes throughout the book, but which to organize my thoughts because I read this ahead of time. I read this
which is
yesterday.
impressive. Usually it's like 15
Mm,
minutes before we record.
yeah, and I had all sorts of thoughts, and I
Hmm.
didn't write them down. And I'm
That's
like,
good.
so what is I was going to say? But anywho, but it goes into like 57, which
Hmm.
I thought was kind of interesting, where he says his rights as pontiff depend on the express appointment of God. His rights as temporal prince are derived from the same source from which other princes derive their rights and are held by the same tenure.
Hmm.
So kind of like, like when the Pope was also a prince, and I guess the Pope still is, in charge of the Vatican government or, the church government, such as it is. But in the olden days when they're sometimes leading the army in a field of battle,
Hmm.
uh, so he's saying, if they have temporal power, that, that power is of the same, I guess, lawful or moral basis as any other prince,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, because I mean,
Mhm.
it's a very sort of practical argument because he's saying, that the Pope at one point in time, was the ruler of all the papal states. He had that very civic authority where he was kind of just a prince in his own right. But clearly, that's not the same right that he's gotten as Pope, to be the Pope, to be the spiritual ruler. Those are coming from two separate means, and the means by which he was controlling the territory specifically was just the same as any other prince. And I think he even makes the point in there that people who kind of, at this time who were Catholics could wage war against the Pope as Prince of the Papal States without, waging war against his spiritual authority, still holding him as the Pope, as the supreme ruler, of the church, but, fighting for territory, in the Papal States, fighting against him as a prince. So it's still that very clear divide where there's two separate sources of power, two separate, conceptions of power. But of course, in this theory, the temporal always flows from the spiritual.
Yeah, and he makes a kind of analogous argument about the then secessionists fighting against the sovereign in the United States. Under the even though there was a moral obligation to the sovereign, the temporal sovereign, the Catholic Church didn't cut off the Catholics that were fighting for the South,
Hmm.
saying they couldn't get. There was a push from religious leaders to have the Catholic Church excommunicate the Catholics in the South
Hmm.
for various reasons, including slavery and all that. But they never took official action, which I guess you'd argue one way or the other, and maybe they should have. But he mentions, that they never cut from a community of the Catholics who in our struggle have joined the secessionists and fought in the ranks against the United States because the prevalence of the doctrine of state sovereignty has seemed so to leave such reasonable doubt as whether they're really rebels fighting against a legitimate sovereign or if
Hmm.
they were a separate sovereign fighting, which we talked about before about
Hmm.
that theory.
Yeah, because the point he's making there is that he says, the church not only distinguishes between the two powers, but recognizes as legitimate governments that manifestly do not derive from God through her. He says even like heretics and infidels can have, just, temporal power. He says St. Paul says, obey the emperor. Even
Yeah.
if the emperor is, a horrible, terrible person, he's clearly not a man of God, he can still have just worldly authority through the systems that exist. But just because they might be a terrible person doesn't mean that their authority is completely invalid.
Yeah.
And
And
that's
I like his argument on this because he talks about, you mentioned St. Augustine and St. Thomas and a couple others. And he said they hold that princes derive their power from God through the people.
Hmm.
So he's starting into this argument where he's saying, well, the spiritual leader is chosen by God or ordained by God, I guess, and the temporal leaders derive their power from God, but through the people.
Hmm.
So that's why even if they're not Christian, in a way, the society has elected them through the people to
Hmm.
be their leaders, depending on how they're selected, of
Yeah.
course. But um, and so they have a certain almost divine authority as the people who have been ordained by the people
Hmm.
who got their authority through God to be our leaders, which I
Yeah.
thought was an interesting, different argument. I don't know that
Yeah.
I don't know if I noticed that from those other philosophers, or I guess I just overlooked it or whatever. But I mean, am I summarizing that argument correctly? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think a little before that on that page, I think you're on page 58. He also makes a really good point. Because he builds up this whole theory that yeah, there is some truth that there are these two powers, and the supernatural in some ways is above the temporal. But he says, the authority of the church is derived immediately from God in a supernatural matter, and she asserts the superiority of her authority. In case of conflict between the two powers, the civil must yield. So if there's ever conflict, the spiritual has more importance. But he says this is only saying that supernatural is above natural. But, and this is the important point, she does not teach nor permit the faithful to hold that the supernatural abrogates the natural or in any way supersedes it. Grace, say the theologians, supposes nature. The church in the matter of government accepts the natural, aids it, elevates it, and is its firmest support. And I think that's a really important point
Yeah,
because
explain
it's,
that because I got a big question mark next to that. Where she does not teach nor permit the faithful to hold that the supernatural abrogates the natural
mhm,
or in any way supersedes it.
mhm. He's saying like it doesn't do away with it. He's not saying he's saying like the supernatural says, okay, I am the only authority. All other, civic authority, anything else has to come through me. It needs my express approval through my supernatural power. I make it exist. He's saying no, the two exist at the same time, and the supernatural can uphold the natural and can help support it. The spiritual power is there to help the natural thrive. It doesn't just do away with all of the natural civic organizations that we have. The two coexist, and if they ever
Hmm.
dispute, the supernatural's better, but they should always coexist. It's not supernatural and nothing.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't. I appreciated the term abrogates.
Hmm.
I was confused by his terminology that there's no way and or in any way supersedes it.
Mm.
I guess supersedes is just another way to say replaces, as
Yeah.
opposed to is preeminent,
Hmm.
right? Supersede, doesn't that replace? I guess that's what he's saying.
Yeah,
So
because
I
I mean,
just
supersede. I
the
mean, in its
word.
root means sit over. So I mean, you can kind of take it in a couple different ways. But I think the point that he's making is that it doesn't just replace it. It doesn't make it the only authority. The spiritual power doesn't just become the only authority because it's over the natural. In some cases, it
Okay,
exists to help support the both.
yeah, all right. I
Yeah,
think you're right in your explanation and help clarify that for me.
you're welcome.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I do agree. Kind of going back to what you were talking about with sort of the democratic theory of vesting sovereignty in the people instead of the king or the nobility or particular families and stuff like that. And again, he goes back to his idea of territory here. I mean, this is just such like a crucial part for him. He says the organic people or people fixed to a given territory, not the people as a mere population, the people in the Republican sense of the word nation, they derive sovereignty from God from whom is all power. It says the people are not God, they're not being God, being only what philosophers call a second cause. They are and can be
Mhm.
sovereign only in a secondary and relative sense. So he says that's the big difference between a lot of the other democratic theories, is that they really
Yeah.
say that the people are the primary cause. They have the authority, somewhere inherent within them and coming together, either social contract, stuff like that, that they become gods themselves and they can shape everything however they want. Brownson's saying, no, of course not. We have what authority we do have given to us by God, and we are only acting as a second cause. We don't just make up the authority ourselves. It has to come from somewhere else.
Yeah, and he says something. It's continues into the top of page 59, which I think was radical to my modern sensibilities. I don't disagree with him. But he says one man has and can have in himself no right to govern another, and as man is never absolutely his own, but always and everywhere belongs to his creator, it is clear that no government originating in humanity alone can be a legitimate government. Every such government is founded on the assumption that man is God, which is a great mistake, and it's fundamental sophism. Um, and I just think that's a really compelling statement, really
Hmm.
powerful statement if you really take it to its logical conclusion, which is if you're basically if you're making yourselves gods through democracy or whatever philosophy, you don't really have a legitimate basis for ruling over anybody else.
Hmm.
So even if we voted for it, you don't have a legitimate government without some sort of religious or God created component.
Hmm.
Isn't that really what he's saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely what he's saying because because I mean, it's almost in some ways like a state of nature argument too, in saying that
Yes.
in generally people just don't have authority over one another. I can't just go outside and tell somebody on the street, "Hey, I suddenly have authority over you." And so it's that same idea. It's we can't just make up that authority ourselves. It has to come from somewhere else. And if we're saying it's just exists because we made it happen, yeah, then that's not legitimate. It has to come from somewhere else.
Well,
Um,
that's his argument. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think he's right. Because I think it's, that's what I'm talking about is I can't, go up and tell anybody else I have authority over them unless something else happens. We don't
Mhm.
just get authority naturally by being who we are, unless, you're the son of a king or something like that. But even in those cases, there's a system already in place that establishes that as the system that we're in. You can't just say suddenly one day I'm going to become, the authority figure here. I don't think anyone can naturally claim just because of who I am that gives me the authority. I don't think that exists.
Yeah, that's what the communists always do. It's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right.
At some point in the revolution, somebody stands up and says, "No, I'm the, I'm the guy,
Yeah, yeah,
and because I am the guy, you got to do what I say, or else." Every time.
yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right.
But of course, we'd all agree that's not legitimate.
Hmm.
So that, yeah, anyway, it's the way he articulates it. I think it just puts it. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, all right.
Hmm.
Um, then he kind of goes back to pre-Christian and
Hmm.
the ancient Gentile philosophers and them being pantheists,
Yeah.
and he talks about, okay, well, without this divine intervention, how do they how do they create governments that have
Hmm.
any sort of legitimacy? And he mentions, which is true, that those people, those philosophers, saw no divine intervention
Hmm.
in anything naturally explicable or explicable by natural law. And I mean, he says some things that are just like, yeah. And I don't know if it's been such a long time since I've really thought about these things, or if he just puts them in such a basic way. Like that's true, and so because they looked for the divine in things that were not natural.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And
because I mean,
if they thought they could explain it, then that's not godlike.
mhm.
That's not divine. And I think that's a dangerous road to go down. And it
Yeah.
seems to me that's one of his points.
Because I think the bigger point he's making is about the idea of creation, and that none of
Yeah,
these ancient people had any concept of things being made from nothing. Some of them
yeah,
had an idea of some sort of intelligent design, but it was always somebody shaping things that were already there. Things
yeah.
had to exist first that were just substances, sort of the Platonic forms or something like that, or the base elements had to exist somewhere. And then, maybe there was an intelligent, force that helped shape those things, but nowhere do they have that idea of, no, these things were created by God who had a plan from the beginning. It has to, they have some elements that are just before God, that have to exist before God. They can never really get that idea. Um,
Mm,
and I think he says somewhere in there, I really like to quote, let me see if I can find it. Um, Maybe not. But it was along the lines of, they because they can never get to the divine creation of man, they can never really get to the idea of where authority really comes from. If people were created, not really from any true design, or there's not really anything special there, it's just some sort of abstract reason, maybe, then how do we get authority? How do we get government from that? He says, they're all kind of lacking. A lot of them had their theories, but they never really got there. because they say everything's pantheist, everything is God or is an emanation from God, but there's no idea of providence or the action of God in nature through natural agencies, through natural laws, things like that. You don't have that real agent behind things. Everything's just kind of fluid, and everything is God, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he kind of continues on, and he talks about, okay, what's the Christian theory of government, the authority of government. And there's some quotes in there. Maybe you want to visit with those, but I'm looking at 60, like the middle of the page. He says, but by asserting the divine origin of government, Christianity consecrates civil authority, clothes it with a religious character, and makes civil disobedience, sedition, insurrection, rebellion, revolution, civil turbulence of any sort or degree, sins against God, as well as crimes against the state. And that kind of alarms me a little bit. But I think he ends up coming down not agreeing with that statement. I think he's explaining a philosophy. But what are your thoughts on that, and whether he agrees with that statement ultimately, or if he's just trying to describe what Christian philosophers have asserted in the past?
I
If
mean,
you
I think
understand.
I think he agrees with an element of it because I mean, what he's saying is, if we agree that there is a plan for things and that humans have authority given by God, then there has to be some divine element in government. And I think that's where he goes, kind of go back to, St. Paul says, obey the emperor. That's a moral command because, the emperor has some amount of that divine authority, not because he's a particularly good person or he was supernaturally endowed with the authority, but because he is human. And humans all have that divine aspect to them for government and things like that. And so government itself has to be, through those second causes of humanity, something that reflects something of the authority of God. It's not a perfect reflection, but if you go against that authority without good cause, if you're just rebelling because you want more stuff or something like that, then yeah, of course not. That's not going to be a good thing for you to do. That's going to be a sin in some regard.
Do you agree with that?
I think so. I think I do.
Hmm. What would the practical implications of that be in the United States of America now?
I don't know. I think I've actually had a conversation with somebody back at Truman about this. I think early on, because he sounded crazy to me when I was first talking to him. Because he's like, I can't really see like a Christian justification for the American Revolution. If we're called to respect the civil authority, and he had some quotes from like Saint Augustine that says don't rebel, unless these conditions are met and stuff like that. I don't think we met those conditions, that these people have laid out. It didn't really make much sense to me then. I'm like, well, of course, the British were tyrants and things like that. Of course we had to establish a new government and stuff like that. But I mean, thinking back on that, I think he had a point. I'm not sure exactly where I fall if, if the American Revolution was inherently unchristian or something like that. But I think that idea of authority has to come from something that's not us is that idea. And if it does come from something that's not human, then we have to be moving against God in some way or some of the natural law in some way, if not God himself.
Interesting. Yeah, it is funny to hear those kind of thoughts about the revolution now, because I'm thinking, when you really look at the facts and the complaints and the grievances of the revolutionaries, it begs the question of whether or not we have more or less freedom now under the
Yeah.
under the United States current system,
Hmm.
or whether, because, like, for instance, I can't travel. Of course, I'm using a public roadway, but I can't travel from here to any other part of the county without running the risk of getting stopped by the police for some traffic violation.
Yeah.
And I'm in the system. I mean, I'm part of the system, but
Hmm.
I'm like, any one of us could, in theory, because you could be arrested for speeding. So you're going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. They can actually arrest you. They don't have to just give you a ticket, at least in Missouri.
Yeah.
And I could go straight to jail.
Yeah.
You know, I'll be in there, and so there's a lot, practically and theoretically, there's a lot less freedom now than there was for those colonialists, those
Yeah.
revolutionaries back in the 1700s. Just
Hmm.
practically speaking, the government, they could what are they border their troops in your home, and there are certain issues about search and seizure, but I mean they still had some protections.
Hmm.
as subjects of the crown. But practically speaking, is it more or less likely that they were spied upon by the government, or whether I was spied upon by the government? Just,
Yeah.
I mean, we're all being spied upon by our government, but it's kind of like inadvertently now.
Hmm.
Like they're collecting all our data, and then it's just a matter of whether they bother to look. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where where we're at. We're all being spied upon
Yeah.
by our own government, and our only protection, our only anonymity is that there's so much of us and there's too much data for anybody to practically look through all that stuff. But if you
Mhm.
get in their crosshairs, for whatever reason, watch out.
Yeah.
So considering that, if they were justified, how justified am I? I'm not going to be, I'm not revolutionary, but it's like, it really starts
Yeah.
getting you. And then if they weren't justified, am I justified? And when can you fight against a government, or is it only civil disobedience?
Hmm.
Is it only, okay, here's the consequences for not doing those things, like not paying your taxes or not agree, following all the laws? Well, then you're going to go to jail eventually and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So like, it's part of one way to fight the power, so to
Mhm.
speak, like the whole nonviolent protests, advocated by Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all that stuff. But
Yeah. I mean, that's
I
kind
don't
of where you get, the arguments of people like Russell Kirk and talking about the American Revolution. Because I think the phrase he uses is that it was a revolution. What does he say? A revolution not fought but prevented, I think is the word he uses, because he essentially says that a lot of the stuff written, in the Declaration of Independence, the individual grievances and things like that, a lot of that was performative, really for the French to see and have sympathy, for the American colonists and things like that, a very practical political thing. But really, like the motivating factor for the revolutionaries in America was really just to keep the status quo. Because they had salutary neglect was sort of just the policy at the time when the British kind of just left them alone. They were under the crown to an extent, but they were very much governing themselves.
Yeah,
And
right.
if you look at a lot of the proposals, like we want representation, no taxation without representation. A lot of people take that to mean the American colonists wanted a representative, in Parliament or a couple representatives and stuff like that. But he makes the argument, well, none of them really wanted that because that's entirely impractical. You can't just go across the
Yeah,
ocean to represent and stuff like that. But it was really just leave us alone. And then when the king, started putting more and more things to them, more taxes and stuff like that, that's when they said, okay, well, now you're attacking us. You started this. It wasn't us inciting the revolution. We've been left alone. We're kind of our own people now, but now you're asserting influence that you never had in the first place, and we're just fighting back. So it's like,
yeah,
on what side of the argument? I kind of expect him to make or Brownson to make a similar argument to that at some point in the book, but we'll see.
yeah. Interesting. So I don't know that there's an answer yet from him, from this author,
Hmm.
about when exactly can you start shooting the tyrants. So anyway, um, but then he goes on in 61 to specifically state this direct line of power or authority from the spiritual side, and he said here, I'll just quote it: "The Pope, as the visible head of the spiritual society, is no doubt superior to the Emperor, not precisely because he represents a superior order, but because the Church, of which he is a visible chief, is a supernatural institution and holds immediately from God, while civil society, represented by the Emperor, holds from God only immediately
Hmm.
through second causes or the people." So there's like a almost like a more pure relationship with God on the spiritual side, and it goes through a filter on the government or the temporal side, which I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Assuming
think.
the Pope is worth a damn, I don't know.
But he says, the logical conclusion of, the first theory that he was talking about at the beginning of this chapter, he says, if the universal supremacy claimed for the Pope rejoined the imperialists be conceded, the state would be absorbed in the church, the autonomy of civil society would be destroyed, and civil rulers would have no functions but to do the bidding of the
Mm,
clergy. And I think he's
true,
right to a degree. I think, that that's
100%.
that's the point he's making is that, you have to have two different spheres. Otherwise, everybody is just, a member of the church and you just have to do what the clergy says. And clearly that's not practical because, the state does different things than the church needs to do. They have very different goals, very different spheres of influence, and they should stay that way to some degree. They should always support each other. We don't want them, the wall of church and state, they act completely separately, but that they have their own separate goals in mind.
Yes.
Um, and then he moves on, and he says, but in that controversy, and he was talking about, the two swords doctrine and who really has authority. And in the heat of that controversy, neither party clearly and distinctly perceived the true state of the question. Each was partly right and partly wrong. The imperialists wanted room for the free activity of civil society. The church wanted to establish in that society the supremacy of the moral order or the law of God, without which governments can have no stability and society no real well-being. And he says the real solution was to be found in the doctrine of the church, of course, and had been given time and time again by her most approved theologians. And that's kind of what you were talking about earlier, is that, that's the solution here. It's not that one has more than the other, or more authority in every matter than the other, but, you have this separate flow of power, one more directly, one mediately. And so therefore, the civil authority has to come through the people in some regard.
Yes. And then he goes on to talk about whether or not you can have legitimate authority for government without God.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was really this last paragraph in 62. He had a lot of really, really powerful words here where he's saying, but is the illogical or necessary result of the attempt to erect the state on atheistic principles. And he talks about if you have a government, and this is me talking, if you have a government that's formed and based upon atheistic principles, you end up with just no right but might. You have to have the brute force to maintain that power, because there's no a spiritual component, which of course you're not going to have buy-in from the people either if you don't have some sort of agreement or some sort of Christian principles at the basis of it. And he says the end aimed at has been good, laudable even, but they forgot that freedom is possible only with the authority that protects it against license and as well as against despotism. And I think that is the key to our current problems.
Mm-hmm.
One of the keys to our current problems. One is the desecration of man, where we just don't value the individual or the spiritual component of everybody's own personal kind of divinity. And the second, which is really a corollary, I guess, is that we have to have a government that protects us against licentiousness, let's say it, licentiousness, as well as against despotism, or tyranny. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think the generations before us really understood that a lot better. They used to, they used to have in police departments, this is before my time, they used to have vice squads, like in bigger departments. What's the vice? Well, gambling, prostitution, and drugs. And so that's what those units or departments of the police department would be going after. Those vices. They're vice crimes. They're sins. There's crimes of some sort of moral depravity, as opposed to crimes against person like assaults or DWIs or traffic control or whatever. But we've lost that concept that the government, one of the primary roles of government is to protect us from our own I always can't pronounce it. Licentiousness.
Yes. No, I agree with him. Absolutely.
It's not like some sort of clue in some sort of mental defect. Like, you got that brain disease if you can't pronounce that word.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a hard time.
But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with him. And he makes a similar point. So he's kind of saying, that's the job of the government, but he also says, what's kind of the job of the people too? And what are we at here? He says a little bit earlier on page 62. He's talking.
I'm trying to move this thing forward. You blame me for the rants, but every time I skip a half a page, we go back. Every time.
I think he makes an important point here. Because he says, talking about modern thinkers about government, he says they have not only separated the state from the church as an external corporation, but from God as its eternal lawgiver, and by doing so have deprived the state of her sacredness, inviolability, or hold on to conscience, scoffed at loyalty as a superstition, and consecrated not civil authority, but what is called the right of insurrection. You're showing me that you have that.
Showing you that I have that circled, but I skipped it for time consideration.
Yes, but he says
great minds think alike.
Yes,
yes. Go ahead, make your point.
Because he says, they're teaching, the age sympathizes not with authority in its efforts to sustain itself, but it's, celebrating those who conspire against it, the insurgents, rebels, revolutionists seeking its destruction. I think he's absolutely right too. We've gotten to the point, if you remove the spiritual aspect of the state and public life, you both have a government that isn't really upholding anything, and you have a
Yes.
people that have no desire to uphold the government. They both
Yes.
are just completely apathetic to most things or come up with their own weird branch of morals that aren't in line with really anything.
Mhm.
And really, they feel that if everything's created by men, they can just create something anew on both sides. The
Yeah.
government doesn't have any idea of the goal it should have in protecting the social good of the people, and the people have no idea of the role that they have in making sure that loyalty and authority and order are upheld. And they just want to make new stuff all the time because nothing has any real meaning. And I think he's very, very ahead of his time in saying all this.
Yeah. And it's like a rudderless ship, or it's there's no foundation. If you don't have those basic tenets, then you just keep going from one thing to another. You're flitting back
Hmm.
and forth. There's no anchor.
Yeah.
You're just going up and down with the tide, I guess.
Hmm. And then he kind of goes on to talk about, why he believes that this is true. And I see what you were saying kind of at the beginning of the podcast here. He's kind of just asserting things a little bit, and he doesn't go into
Yes.
to logical proofs necessarily. He says, this doctrine is not mere theory. It simply states the real order of things. It's like, okay.
Yes.
But, he says, government has relation to God, which nature herself holds to him. The idea God created the heavens and the earth is the first principle of all science. And so essentially, it's just that in God creating everything, the creature derives from his creative act, must keep himself bound to that creative act. I can never separate myself from the act of creation. God is constantly sort of in a state of creating everything. And so we recognize that all natural things have to have authority in God. And so
Mhm.
I think, to believe this, of course, you have to be a Christian. And I don't think he really predicted that, his audience would ever be a bunch of atheists, and discussing the nature of the United States. At his time, everybody was a Christian, so everybody would have found the logical, proof there. That, well, of course, this has to be true. Therefore, the authority has to come through there. But I don't think we would have predicted just the amount of atheists and stuff that we have in the country now.
True. Yeah, and then he goes on to talk about like the role of God in our lives and in government, and once we create the system.
Hmm.
And I thought this was really something where he says here, and I because I always struggle with the argument, the counter argument about God's direct involvement in our lives. Like the free will versus, like, is it fair that he influences us? Is it how much does God actually answer prayers? That type of thing. But he says it is a bad philosophy as theology to suppose that God created the universe, endowed it with a certain laws of development or activity, wound it up, gave it a jog, set it a going, and left it to go on itself. It cannot go of itself because it does not exist of itself, which I think is really kind of poignant.
Hmm.
You know, because we are part of His creation, therefore we're part of Him, or yeah, Him, and so then um so there is a role for God
Hmm.
because this we are part of his creation. We can't exist outside of him. It's not
Yeah.
like he could set us like you create a Lego castle and you put it somewhere and you leave. And
Hmm.
we're alive and it's part of his creation. So there's no complete separation from the
Yeah.
two. So it's pretty interesting and compelling.
Yeah, because what he says is, providence or God's plan, in sort of an active role. He says is as necessary as creation, or rather, providence is only continuous creation. It's
Right.
just the continuing action of God. The plan that He has, and then he kind of goes on. This part reminded me a lot of Tolkien's ideas of the subcreation.
Yeah, sure.
Humans as creative beings, as a reflection of God.
Right.
Because he says, through creative act, man participates of God. And that's kind of what you were talking about. As God's creatures, we have to participate in his creation. We have to create as well. And so, we acting as second causes of God, that's how we come up with government. We have that authority because we are these created beings. We are made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, some element of his plan has to come through us. If providence is found in all of creation, providence has to come through humans. We are part of creation. We are those second causes. And that's really where authority comes from. He says a government founded on atheistical principles were less than a castle in the air. And I think that's a good line there. It's not really founded on
Yeah.
anything. You might have a structure, but the structure's on nothing. It's a castle on air. It's going to fall.
Right.
You have nothing.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, as far as, a Christian nation or a nation that uh, is created of the people from God. And he says, you have a duty as a matter of conscience to support that
Hmm.
country, which I think is a pretty bold assertion. And then he says, it's the both the state and the church are both from God. And he says, he who dies on the battlefield fighting for his country ranks with him who dies at the stake for his faith.
Hmm.
I haven't heard anybody assert that in a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I mean, back in the Veterans Day stuff when I was a kid, that's the kind of stuff that they would say.
Yeah.
But it's been so long, it's kind of jarring to see those words now because
Hmm.
people don't equate patriotism. Actually, a lot of weirdos equate patriotism with racism or evil or whatever.
Yeah.
So this is kind of jarring, but it flows logically from his argument that
Hmm.
that society is a natural creation of the human order and therefore part of God's creation.
Hmm.
And how we form society, which is government, must be in some ways divine.
Yeah.
If you uphold certain necessary um, beliefs with regard to, whether it's Christian beliefs or whether it's just uh, a sense of justice and fair play from the natural law, whether it's a Christian
Hmm.
nation or not, there's a certain divinity of the government, which
Yeah.
and then you owe it a duty of loyalty if you're in that country and you're
Hmm.
part of that. It's logical, but it's not something you hear articulated. I don't think in modern
Yeah.
times at all. I
No.
don't hear anybody saying you owe a moral duty of loyalty to your country.
Hmm.
I mean, who's a current thinker that says that?
I don't
I
think
don't
of
know a single
anybody.
one.
Yeah.
A single one. I think we're all saying you know, what do they say? Dissent is the highest form of patriotism,
Hmm.
which is, dissent is statements, but we've gotten to the point where it's like revolution is the highest form of patriotism. And I'm
Yeah.
like, maybe, I don't know if that's the truth,
Yeah,
but
because what he says, and I like his point here too, is that the people, if they have authority from God, they're not holding it as an inherent part of their being. It's not just something that is within me personally, but he says they're holding it as a trust from God. It's not
yeah,
this permanent state of being, but it's been given to us. We're holding it as a trust from God, and he says that's the guarantee against both oppression, bad government tyranny. And for the government to have guarantees against sedition, insurrection, rebellion, revolution, right? Because we're holding that authority on a divine level. We're holding that authority as a trust from God.
yeah,
Therefore, if we don't want to blaspheme against God or use His authority in immoral ways, we'll make sure we're treating everybody fairly. And on the other side, we're not going to rebel against this government. The point that you were just making.
yeah,
And I think that's a great logical conclusion, but of course it doesn't hold up when the entirety of your government is made up by atheists and horrible people. And I think he's making a
I,
very good argument for why a Christian nation can be a good thing. Having politicians as Christians because they would believe in this sort of higher power.
yes, and I think that's the one of the more powerful arguments he makes in a practical
Hmm.
uh, way for us in the present day is to remember that those who hold some sort of governmental authority or power do hold it in trust for everybody
Hmm.
else. And I think our politicians on all parties, everywhere, at all levels, have forgotten that. And I think I think people really ought to be reminded. Oh yeah, you're just holding this in trust, and all of us, including you now, as you're an adult, to hold whatever authority that you have in trust for the next generation.
Hmm.
And I think that really went to the wayside with the baby boomer generation, and then my generation kind of continued the trend,
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, let's just take what we can get for us. And what is it? was it YOLO? You only live once.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's right.
you only live once. But what about your fucking kids? Pardon my language. Does he care about them? Well, they can take care of themselves. They got it easy, those whippersnappers,
Yeah.
and not because of you bastards. Anywho, but my
Uh,
parent, I can insult boomers. Our family can insult boomers because we skipped a generation.
yeah.
Nobody in my family was a boomer because my parents are so old. By the time they had kids, we skipped the boomer generation, went straight from the greatest generation to Generation X, which is the second greatest generation,
Yeah, no, I think,
Gen
yeah,
X.
sure.
I'm
But then he goes on at the bottom of page 65. Um,
already on 67. What are you doing? We don't have to read the whole damn thing to everybody. What are you
all
saying
right,
about 65? I'm past that.
yes, well, we can move on really quickly.
What is the most important point you have on 65?
Yeah, at the bottom of page 65, he says, the people, though sovereign under God, are
Already
not
said
the
that. Not
government.
the government. The government is in their name and by virtue of authority delegated from God through them. We already covered that.
All right. Well,
I do
that's just
have that
another
underlined. I have that
emphasize that
underlined
again. Well,
too.
that's good.
Yep. But
Because it's
he goes on to say that if they forget to undertake those duties, they are likely to abuse their power and to sanction injustice, which
mhm,
is in the top of 66, which I think is a good point too. But I
yes.
just kind of said that with my little monologue.
Yes. Well, we can move on then to his final little section here where he's kind of just
Yes.
summing up, all of his
Roman numeral
ideas.
8 on
Yes, Roman
67.
numeral 8
Yes.
on 67. And I'm just going to read, a couple sentences here. He says, the right of government to govern or political authority is derived by the collective people or society from God through the law of nature. Rulers hold from God through the people or nation, and the people or nation hold from God through the natural law. How nations are founded or constituted, or a particular people becomes a sovereign political people, invested with the rights of society will be considered later. But that's his idea of the right of government, right? It's sort of a two-way process, both through God, through the law of nature. Rulers have to have authority from the people, and the people are working with their authority through the natural law. It has to come kind of from both directions at the same time, but ultimately its source in both ways is from God.
Yeah, and I think he has convinced me. I'm on board with that part of his philosophy 100%. And then he goes on to the next page, but we can go back if I skip to your points. Where it says in 68, the political sovereignty under the laws of nature attaches to the people, not individually, but collectively as civil or political society. And he goes on to talk about, how it vests in the political community, blah, blah, blah. But he also says all men are equal. And I think, at this point in the nation's history, that was a hotly disputed topic, even immediately after the Civil War. There's a lot of racism and real racism and discrimination, that kind of stuff. So he's reasserting that. But the very last sentence, and I know I'm skipping, and you can go back, but he ends this whole treatise almost on the origin of government to say they should form no privileged class in the state or political society. Uh, talking about the aristocracy or the people from birth or whatever. But I like I like how he, on the one hand, explains how we can have a hierarchical society and government with legitimate authority, but also he's reminding us that all men are equal and nobody should have a privileged class in the state or in political society. So I think I agree with all that,
Mm-hmm.
and he does a really great job in articulating all this stuff in ways that are easy to read
Mm-hmm.
for me. And
Yeah.
I don't like to struggle through older tomes and volumes. I do from time to time, but I find because my vocabulary is not tremendous and just the way that things are phrased, I think I have a harder time reading them than something written at what now they say like a fourth grade level English for popular books. But he is writing very specifically, and I think it's so easy to read his thoughts, and they're so precise, and it just seems jam packed with. If he had a copy editor, he should have given that person a prize because he's very precise and
Yeah.
he doesn't waste a lot of words, unlike
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah. Well, something tells me he didn't have a copy editor because his whole career was in writing. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing this is just him. And I agree with you there. It's very clear. But I think the point that he does make about, authority being in society collectively is really
Yes.
important because I think a lot of people now, especially see, nations and governments as really just like the mean average of all of the opinions of the people. And that's not
Yes.
really what society is. It's not just we're counting up everybody's opinion on what things should be and saying, okay, well, here's, the mean or here's the most popular one. This is how our government's going to be. We have to recognize that there's something more to society, and authority isn't just counting heads. Right? It has to be something different than that. It has to be something more that is the common good of society, not just the good of, the greatest number of individuals, because that's just utilitarianism. And we've talked about, that at length. I mean, even back in season one. But things like that where it's, stressing either the individual or just like groups too much as their own, coherent units or separating people out in those regards can't really be done. You have to recognize that there's something above all of the people, and that is society. And
Hmm.
that is where the government gets its authority from, through, the natural law. I agree. I'm absolutely convinced by him for sure.
Yeah, and one of the other side effects of really following his this philosophy that he espouses it is a little disconcerting to me, but it also um, causes you have to have more respect for the current regime
Mm,
than I do now. You know, because there's some you can't just have that believe that God is acting through us as a society and forming our government, and also think that all those people that disagree with me are just the dumbest, stupidest, evilest people in the world. And I think that if we all believed similarly to what he does, I think it'd be better for our nation
yeah.
because then we'd be able to communicate better without just insulting each other. But boy, it's hard, you
Hmm.
know. Um, but anyway, so it would force you to value those that you dissent with or disagree with that are active in government or would be active in government, and so I think there would be a beneficial effect if we all believed
Yeah.
similar to what he's espousing here in this
Yeah.
chapter. Great author, great thinker.
Hmm.
I'm very impressed with it.
Yeah. And I mean, all of his, most of these past four episodes now, including this one, have just been him tearing down other theories. I mean, he just does
Yeah.
such a good job of that too, that when he does come along and puts together his own, theory that he actually believes in, I think does a really successful job, if for no other reason than it seems like he's ruled out every other possible option. So it's very well structured, very great. Of course, we still have like half the book to go,
Yes.
which I'm happy about. The next chapter is the constitution of government. So we talked about the origin. Now we're talking about constitution. How government is actually organized or should be organized. So that should be good coming up here too.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Do you have any other final thoughts?
No,
All right. Well, this has been season 9, episode 6, I think, of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
still Mark Bishop.
You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.